As you know, the big midterm elections are coming up next Tuesday. We focus quite a bit here on the candidates, on the messages, on how important it is to vote. But one other aspect of this election coming up that needs a lot of attention is election integrity. Now, listen, a lot of states went through the proper constitutional motions over the last year and a half and tightened up their voter protocols to make sure that we didn't have the same kind of questions that we did after the last presidential election in 2020. I mean, we have a simple request here on this program. Number one, that the laws of each state are actually followed. Yeah, the laws that were passed by the legislature and then signed into law by the governor. Follow the laws with regard to your elections. And number two, if possible, could we all walk away after Election Day or election month and be confident in the fact that even if our guy lost, at least everything was done fair and square? That's all we ask. It doesn't seem like too much. Well, we just had a victory, we meaning the American people, had a victory in the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court yesterday that maybe moves us a little closer to those two goals. And the gentleman who really carried home the victory is the lawyer for the Dillon Law Group, Gary Lawkowski, who joins us now. Counselor, congratulations. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. It's great to be here with y'all.
You know, I saw the decision you had from the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and it's fantastic that you got this. But I looked at what they affirmed, and I got to tell you, I can't believe this was even argued in the first place. This has to do with mail-in ballots and whether they should be counted or not based on following the law that the state of Pennsylvania laid out. What exactly were the Democrats asking for here?
It's really extraordinary. In a lot of ways, you know, we just had Halloween, and it's like watching one of these monster movies. They brought this case first in federal court. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court reversed and said, no, this isn't the law. You have to follow the law in Pennsylvania. Then the Secretary of State, who's an unelected official, decided, nah, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to, on my own, say, no, you don't have to have this date. So it's really extraordinary that they did this. Yeah. And luckily, the RNC and some other groups were able to go into state court and get the Supreme Court to rule on that.
I just want to be clear here. This was a provision. Again, it's the law of the state of Pennsylvania that if you mail in a ballot, it has to have a valid date on the outside of the envelope. It seems like a no-brainer. Why wouldn't you? But they were arguing, this Secretary of State, as you said, an unelected official, just said, forget it. We're going to ignore that. We'll count ballots even if they don't have any date on them or an invalid date.
Yes. It's extraordinary.
What argument is being made here? I mean, how can they even try to justify that?
Well, they try to say, well, it doesn't really matter. This law is not that important. We don't think, that it's too hard to write down those couple numbers next to your signature. We think that's going to cause problems for people. What the General Assembly, what the people of Pennsylvania say, that doesn't really matter. We think we know better. It's just a polite suggestion. It's not a requirement.
And now, not to relitigate the past, as it were, but this is what happened in 2020 in Pennsylvania, is it not? Didn't I don't know if it's the same Secretary of State, but they sort of overlooked what the standard protocols were. But that was done under the COVID-19 health pandemic provisions, right?
That's part of what's so extraordinary here is this case came up to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court in 2020. At that time, a majority of the judges said, look, Pennsylvania law means what it says. Because of the procedural posture of the case, they let them kind of do it because of COVID and some other reasons in 2020. But they said, the law means what it says. You need to have this date. And yet the Secretary of State in this case, after the Supreme Court reversed the Third Circuit, still came out and said, hey, I think the Pennsylvania law says something different. I'm not going to do it, which is, again, extraordinary because they had this case in 2020 and a majority of the court said otherwise.
We're speaking with Gary Lawkowski. He's the counselor for this huge victory on behalf of Dillon Law Group, the RNC, a couple of other litigants here, making sure that the state of Pennsylvania will segregate and not count mail-in ballots that don't have a valid date or any date at all, for that matter, on the envelope. I hate to ask this, but how can we be sure this will be followed? How can we know for sure that in certain districts in and around Philadelphia, they won't say, screw it, we're just going to count these things? Because you can't go back. You can't put the genie back in the bottle, as we've learned.
I mean, this is where it's important to have a robust operation dealing with poll watchers and having people on the ground who can kind of intervene and notice that when it's happening so that we can raise any challenges that need to be raised. Otherwise, it's the order of the court. These counties should be following the order of the court.
And
That's what the rule of law requires.
And as of now, Pennsylvania, they've been getting early voting now, I think, for several weeks. But none of those envelopes have been opened and counted yet, right? The law is that they wait until Election Day.
I believe that's right.
So theoretically, it should be very easy. They can't say, oh, it was at the last minute, it was in the final week before the election. They should be able to just go through all those envelopes and say, yep, this can be counted. Nope, that can't be counted. And that's the end of it.
Yep, and they should be putting those ones that don't have that date in a separate pile according to the court order. That way, if something happens and that gets changed, there's a way to go back and look at that. But they shouldn't be counting them as normal ballots.
Was Mark Elias involved in this case at all? Was he arguing on behalf of counting these ballots?
Yes, so the Elias Law Group represented the DCCC. They tried to intervene in this case, and it did not go their way.
But let's just refresh our memories. This is the same guy who worked for the Hillary Clinton campaign and the DNC back in 2016, and he was involved in the creation of what we now know as the Steele dossier, which started the Russian collusion hoax to undermine then candidate Trump, but eventually President Trump. And now this is what his law group does, right? They basically challenge these laws state by state, hoping that they can basically overlook the existing election laws.
That certainly seems to be the strategy, is going into a number of different states and picking these fights on long-standing election integrity requirements. And we saw this in Virginia as well, where we had a case with the Elias Law Group that they recently dismissed with prejudice, where they tried to say that people didn't need to provide a social security number to identify themselves when they registered to vote. Yeah, this seems to be their playbook.
And again, is this the end of it? Have we heard anything from the Secretary of State in response to this? Have they vowed to fight this all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, or is this just done?
So under Pennsylvania law, this will be done. So the Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled based on Pennsylvania law, and they're the authority for interpreting that. If someone wanted to try to come in and make an 11th hour challenge, you'd have to do it under federal law, and you'd probably have to do it in federal court. Now, they've already done that once. It went to the Third Circuit, and that case got vacated by the Supreme Court with a couple of justices writing earlier saying they're incredibly skeptical of the theory. So I don't think it would be a good use of their time, but we'll see what they want to do.
In the meantime, Counselor, and we just have about a minute left here, but we've heard that Pennsylvania, it could take weeks to find out who won this close Senate race between John Fetterman and Mehmet Oz. This is where the counting of these ballots really becomes crucial and critical. Is there a way for the RNC to sort of preempt this process? You said that we need to have robust observation of the counting of these ballots, but I remember the days after 2020 when they were pushing people out of the room. They were putting paper up on the windows. They didn't want to let anybody see what was going on. Can we get out in front of that now and make sure that that doesn't happen again?
I think the way to get out in front of that at this point is to be organized and to be prepared for Election Day, to have your people in place and to be ready to go if whatever happens, happens. We hope and we expect it to be an above board election. We have no reason to doubt that won't be the case, but it's a trust but verify situation. And that's, that's part of the American system, is that you have Republicans looking over the shoulders of Democrats, Democrats looking over the shoulders of Republicans. That's how we make sure that everything's fair and that everybody understands, the election was done in accordance with the rules.
Which,
again,
it's all we ask. That's all we ask.
Exactly.
Well, hopefully, listen, they won't be able to say, oh, you can't come in here and look over our shoulders because you've got COVID and you're going to make me sick and kill me. They can't use that fake excuse this time around. So we will be watching. In the meantime, celebrate the victory. Thank you for fighting this fight, and I appreciate you joining us. More to come on O'Connor Tonight.